Hey Kurt, those are some really good questions. I think in response to your first question about whether we need a new mindset as individuals or whether we need a new system collectively, I think this is a really difficult problem to try to understand. This dichotomy between individual change on the level of individual lives, and change on the level of an entire political system or society. Now, I think every election, in America or in a democratic system, for the most part, well, let's just stick with America. We're faced with two choices, and my reaction is always, why are these the only two choices? I don't like either one of them. Both are inept. And if we look at the Democrat and Republican, the liberal and conservative positions, I think usually one takes one side or the other based upon how one comes down on the very question that you asked, Kurt, about whether what we need is individual change or what we need is social or state change, change the level of our national policy. And I think, first of all, it's a false dichotomy, but it's real to the extent that we do have this political practice in our country where two parties, at least at the level of the majority, are so opposed to one another right now that meaningful legislation is almost impossible to pass. This is a reflection of a false dichotomy between the individual and society. The conservative thinks that what we need, this is an oversimplification, but the conservative thinks what we need is individual change, and that the individual is responsible, for their own station in life. The liberal thinks that what we need is social change, systemic change, because ultimately it's the state of society that determines how an individual can express themselves. So for the liberal, the state has a right. The state has a responsibility to the individual. As a conservative, the individual has a responsibility to the state. And if I were to speak about myself personally, I'm not really any more liberal than I am conservative, because I'm just as much in favor of individual rights as I am for social responsibilities. I think they're both necessary elements in any functioning living system. On some level, each of us as individual minds are cells in a social organism. And to that extent, the system and the mind, my mind, are never separate entities. My mind is a product of the system, and the system is a product of our minds. And what the difference between my mind is and our minds are, is something we can spend a lot of time talking about. What is the difference between subjectivity and intersubjectivity, between my mind and our minds? Because that's really where the exchange between individual and society takes place. It's not between my mind and the thing called society. There's no thing called society. It's always an agreement between presently existing individuals. That's what constitutes society. And that puts a lot of pressure, existential pressure, on us as conscious participants in a community, because we realize that we carry the weight of the entire system on our shoulders in each moment. That's what civic responsibility means. You have to participate for the thing to continue living in an orderly and in a flourishing fashion. American democracy isn't really about flourishing. American democracy, the American polis, is a charade, or it's really a parade. It's a form of entertainment that's put on by and paid for by a corporate elite. So politics is as much, it's part of the entertainment industry. The American democratic experiment has been swallowed by the American electronic corporatist experiment. For better or worse, mostly for worse, but I think, as Holderlin, the German poet, said, hidden in the poison is the cure. So there's no turning back, and somehow electronic culture, the American experiment in self-production and individuation has produced a technology that is destroying the world, but that can, or at least is going to have to, if we are to survive, an experiment in a technology that's going to have to find its own way out of the problem it has created. So that's why I would want to make YouTube videos, because somehow electronic culture is going to provide the cure for its own trauma, its own disease, which is this dualistic public-private crisis that we find ourselves existing in as conscious entities in communion with one another. So we don't need a new mindset or a new system. We need a new way of being together, which is both, a new mindset and a new system. But it's not like we started with the system or started with the mindset. We started with each other, with that in-between sort of the ethical space of the encounter that we have with one another as other. That's where political change always has to take place. Otherwise, it's getting lost in the legal system or in the media. It no longer participates in the ethical, in the good. And to that extent, it retards life. Politics today is definitely retarding life. So you also asked, Kurt, about what a thought is, what it means to have a thought, and you asked about emotion, what it is to have an emotion, and as opposed to a thought, or what the difference between a thought and an emotion would be. And I could try to make some associations with these words. If I were going to differentiate a thought from an emotion, I would say that a thought is a concept. It's the formation of a meaning based on a situation. An emotion is, there's never a concept without an emotion, or a thought without an emotion, I would say. But the emotion is that aspect of this event called thinking that draws us towards an object. So the thought is that sort of concept of an object, and an emotion is that which is drawing us towards the object that we are thinking. Emotion is essentially erotic, and because there's no thoughts without emotions, thought is also essentially erotic. There's always a feeling of engagement associated with every thought. But if the thought is that aspect of this feeling of engagement with objects in the world that is withdrawn from that engagement with the object. So the thought steps back and observes the feeling, but the thought is still, it's a part of the feeling. If there weren't a feeling, there could be no thought, in the sense that thoughts actually take place. A thought isn't the same as what we might caricature as an eternal idea that exists in the mind of an unthought being. A thought is something that takes place inside of a human psyche. It's empirical in that sense, in the radical sense that William James would mean, or it's at least psychologically real in the sense that Carl Jung would say. A thought takes place. It's a happening in the universe, in the human part of the universe, perhaps, but it's still it's still actual, and to that extent, when a human has a thought, a human is having an experience of engagement with an object or a body or a person or a being in their environment. An emotion is that which draws us towards others, and the thought is how we reflect on that other. You can never have thoughts without the emotion emerging initially in a sort of pre-reflective way. Then you reflect on it with a thought. But the thought then feeds forward into your motor capacities, into your behavior and your action in the world. So it's not as though thoughts don't have a sort of participatory role to play in what we then emote, what we then feel. The thought isn't always after the feeling. Thoughts can have a sort of precognitive effect on our behavior, and so we can plan the situations we will be in, and so we can plan to elicit certain emotions in the future using thinking, or employing, or using and employing are the wrong metaphor. We don't employ thinking; we are thinking. We only employ ourselves. But there isn't an extent to which thinking and emotion, emoting must be distinguished, because I think emotion is a kind of thought. Thought isn't. You could say that thought is a kind of emotion, but I would argue that thinking is what we essentially are, and the thinking is always desirous of something. It's always a form of emotion. And desire isn't just a positive seeking after. It could also be a sort of negative suffering. Even a suffering is a desire for something other than what there is. Suffering is a kind of passion. So when I say desire, I don't just mean it's a pleasurable sensation. So yeah, thoughts and emotions, they might be something like that, if anything I said makes any sense. What thoughts and emotions have to do with neurons is an interesting question, because I don't think what we're observing is the synaptic patterns which are rippling through our central nervous system. I think what we're observing is the world itself, the becoming of the universe itself. And our neurons are a particular growth of space-time, a particular folding in upon itself of the universe, of space-time, of the fabric of reality, that has come to experience itself as this image. And to that extent, the neurons are as imaginary as the images the materialist thinks are somehow represented chemically or digitally within the skull. Neurons are no more or less mental than they are material. They have interiors, they have an existence in time, a durational experience that flows through the sort of saddleback specious present, as William James called it, that opens us to a future in light of the inheritance of the past. Even neurons exist at this level of experience of time. Even molecules, atoms. Light itself has a finite speed. Light itself exists in time. And so has an experience of what it's like to be. So we're observing the motion of photons as much as we're observing the emotions of our